History is not merely a record of what we built, but of what we chose to forget. If you travel to the borderlands of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, you will find a landscape that feels entirely severed from the modern world. It is a place of black water, towering bald cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, and a silence so heavy it presses against your eardrums. This is the Great Dismal Swamp. Today, it is a national wildlife refuge, a place for hikers, kayakers, and biologists. But for more than 2 centuries, it was something else entirely. It was a secret, sovereign world existing dead center within the heart of the American South, while the plantations of the antebellum South thrived on the brutal efficiency of human bondage. A defiant, invisible empire was flourishing just miles away in the impenetrable muck. Thousands of escaped slaves, indigenous peoples, and outcasts did not just hide in this swamp. They conquered it. They built hidden cities on islands of dry mud, raised families, fought off bounty hunters, and created a complex, self-sustaining society that lasted for generations. They were known as the Maroon communities of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is not a ghost story, though the swamp is haunted by memories. This is the true, astonishing account of America's greatest, longest-running, and most successful resistance movement, a historical reality so well hidden that it was almost erased from the textbooks entirely. Chapter 1. The Labyrinth of Black Water. To understand how an entire civilization could hide in plain sight within the American colonies, one must first understand the geography of the Great Dismal Swamp in the 18th and 19th centuries. Long before it was partially drained by modern engineering, the swamp spanned over 1 million acres, an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. It was a terrifying terrain for the uninitiated. The water, stained a deep ink black by the tannic acid of the juniper and cypress trees, hid treacherous sinkholes and quicksand. The air hummed with millions of mosquitoes, yellow flies, and ticks bearing diseases that could lay a grown man low in 48 hours. Beneath the surface swam venomous cottonmouth water moccasins and massive snapping turtles, while the shorelines were patrolled by black bears, bobcats, and wolves. To the wealthy white planters of Virginia and North Carolina, the swamp was a cursed wasteland. It was a physical manifestation of chaos, a geographical void that defied the orderly lines of British cartography and Southern agriculture. But to those fleeing the horrors of the plantation complex, the swamp's terror was its greatest asset. The very elements that kept the white man out offered the black man protection. The story of the Maroons begins in the late 1600s, almost as soon as chattel slavery became codified in Virginia law. The word Maroon itself derives from the Spanish word cimarron, which originally referred to runaway cattle that had taken to the hills, and later to the enslaved people in the Caribbean and South America who escaped to form independent communities. While the Maroons of Jamaica and Brazil are famous, the American Maroons achieved something arguably more difficult. They maintained a massive, multi-generational Maroonage right in the backyard of the British Empire's wealthiest colonies. Imagine a runaway slave named Thomas. It is the year 1765. Thomas has fled a tobacco plantation in Norfolk County, Virginia, after learning he is to be sold away from his wife and children to the Deep South. He has no map, no compass, and no shoes. Behind him are the baying of bloodhounds and the shouts of slave catchers. He runs toward the one place he knows his masters fear to tread. He plunges into the freezing, waist-deep black water of the swamp. The mud tries to suck the boots off his feet and briars tear at his skin. But Thomas notices something strange as he wades deeper. The sound of the hounds begins to fade. The water masks his scent. The dense canopy of cypress trees blots out, the sun turning day into a perpetual twilight. For the first time in his life, Thomas is completely alone. And for the first time in his life, Thomas is free. But loneliness in the Great Dismal Swamp meant death. To survive, Thomas had to find the others, because deep within the labyrinth, the phantoms of the swamp were waiting. Chapter 2. The Hidden Cities of the Interior. For centuries, historians believed that the slaves who fled to the Great Dismal Swamp were merely outliers, desperate individuals who hid in the brush for a few weeks or months before hunger, disease, or winter forced them to return to their plantations or try to flee north via the Underground Railroad. However, in the early 2000s, a visionary historical archaeologist named Dr. Dan Sayers of American University decided to do something no academic had ever done before. He took a team into the deepest, most inaccessible heart of the swamp to dig. What he discovered shocked the archaeological community and rewrote American history. Deep within the interior, miles away from any solid road, Sayers and his team discovered isolated islands, small patches of elevated dry land surrounded by vast expanses of deep peat bog. And on these islands, they found the unmistakable signs of long-term human habitation. They found post holes from permanent wooden cabins, thousands of fragments of stone tools, clay pipes, and fire pits. Most astonishingly, they found almost no artifacts manufactured by white society. There were no mass-produced British ceramics, no iron nails, no glass bottles. This meant that the people living here were not just camping. They were intentionally living a life of total independence from the global capitalist economy. Let us return to Thomas. As he wanders through the swamp, half-starved and shivering, he is suddenly surrounded. Out from the dense cane breakstep, 3 men. They do not look like the enslaved laborers Thomas has known. They wear clothing woven from wild fibers and animal pelts. They carry spears tipped with sharpened stone and old, rusted muskets. They do not hand Thomas back to his master. Instead, they guide him through a winding, secret pathway, an underwater trail marked only by specific notches carved into submerged cypress knees. If Thomas took one step to the left or right, he would sink into a bottomless mud pit. Finally, the trees clear, and Thomas steps onto an island of dry earth known today by archaeologists as the Grand Ridge. Before him lies a village. Small, low-slung cabins made of cypress bark and mud plaster are arranged in a neat circle around a central plaza. Smoke rises from communal cooking fires. Children who have never seen a white man, who have never heard the crack of a whip, are playing in the dirt. Women are grinding wild grain and weaving mats from wiregrass. This was the Maroon reality. It is estimated that between 1700 and 1860, anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 people lived permanently in the interior of the Great Dismal Swamp. It was a completely egalitarian society, born out of a shared trauma and a shared desire for liberty. Chapter 3. The economy of Defiance. Living in a swamp, however, presented monumental challenges. How did thousands of people feed themselves without access to traditional agriculture, horses, or plows? How did they survive the brutal winters when the swamp water froze over? The Maroons developed a highly sophisticated, adaptive culture that blended African agricultural traditions, Native American survival skills, and sheer American ingenuity. The swamp diet. The Maroons could not clear large fields for farming because the smoke in open spaces would alert white scouts or surveyors. Instead, they practiced micro-agriculture. They cleared tiny hidden patches of land on the interior islands, growing high-yield crops that thrived in acidic soil, such as corn, beans, and certain varieties of feral sweet potatoes. But the majority of their sustenance came from the swamp itself. The Maroons became master foragers and hunters. They hunted deer, black bears, and raccoons using silent weapons, bows and arrows, spears, and deadfall traps to avoid making noise with firearms. The black waters provided an endless supply of catfish, perch, and eels, which they caught using intricate wicker traps placed in the deep creeks. The architecture of invisibility. The cabins discovered by Dr. Dan Sayers were masterpieces of camouflage. They were built without iron nails, which could catch the light or rust and leave a trail. Instead, the Maroons used interlocking logs joined by wooden pegs and bound with vines. The roofs were thatched with local reeds and covered with thick layers of moss and dirt. From a distance of just 20 yards, a Maroon cabin looked completely indistinguishable from a natural hillock or a pile of fallen forest debris. Furthermore, the Maroons practiced strict light discipline. Fires were only lit during the day, using dry juniper wood that produced virtually no smoke. At night, the villages plunged into total darkness, save for the natural bioluminescence of the swamp's foxfire fungi. The indigenous connection. The Maroons were not alone in the swamp. Long before the first European slave ships arrived in Virginia, Native American tribes, including the Nansemond, the Choanoke, and the Tuscarora, had used the Great Dismal Swamp as a refuge from colonial encroachment. When escaped African slaves began filtering into the swamp, they encountered these indigenous remnants. Instead of conflict, a beautiful synthesis occurred. The Native Americans taught the Africans which swamp plants were safe to eat, how to use the bark of the sweet gum tree for medicine, and how to fashion stone tools from river pebbles when iron was unavailable. In return, the Africans brought new perspectives on resistance and community building. This intermarriage of cultures created a unique Afro-Indigenous Maroon identity that defined the swamp for nearly 2 centuries. Chapter 4. The Canal and the Counter-Economy. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the outer world began to encroach upon the borders of the Great Dismal Swamp. The American nation was growing, and its appetite for lumber was insatiable. The swamp was home to some of the finest old-growth Atlantic white cedar and bald cypress trees in the world, wood that was highly prized for making shingles, ship masts, and building foundations because of its natural resistance to rot. In 1793, construction began on the Dismal Swamp Canal, a massive engineering project spearheaded by none other than George Washington himself decades prior through his Dismal Swampland Company. The goal was to cut a waterway straight through the swamp to connect the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia with the Albemarle Sound in North Carolina, allowing lumber to be easily transported. To dig this canal, white companies hired out thousands of enslaved laborers from local plantations. These men, known as swamp shingle getters, were forced to work in horrific conditions, standing waist-deep in freezing mud for 12 hours a day, clearing trees and digging out the canal by hand. This industrialization of the swamp's periphery could have been the death knell for the Maroon communities. Instead, it created an incredible, clandestine counter-economy. The Maroon communities quickly realized that the enslaved canal workers were their natural allies. A complex network of trade and espionage developed between the free Maroons living in the deep interior and the enslaved workers operating on the fringes. The shingle getters would secretly leave iron tools, gunpowder, shoes, blankets, and news of the outside world at designated drops deep in the woods. In exchange, the Maroons, who were master woodsmen, would harvest extra timber, split shingles, and hunt wild game for the canal workers. The canal workers would then pass off the Maroon-made shingles as their own production, earning extra money from their masters, a portion of which they would use to buy more supplies for the Maroons. This system was so widespread that it became an open secret among white overseers. A prominent 19th century writer, Frederick Law Olmsted, who would later design New York's Central Park, traveled through the Great Dismal Swamp in the 1850s and wrote extensively about this phenomenon. Olmsted noted that the swamp was full of runaways who lived a life of complete independence, and that white lumber masters often looked the other way, because the Maroons were providing valuable labor through the proxy of the enslaved shingle getters. The Maroons had turned the engine of Southern capitalism into a mechanism for their own survival. Chapter 5. The Geography of Freedom. To appreciate the sheer scale of this achievement, one must contrast the life of a Maroon in the Great Dismal Swamp with the life of a slave on a Virginia plantation. Just 10 miles north of the swamp, an enslaved man could be whipped for looking a white man in the eye. His marriage was not recognized by law. His children could be torn from his arms and sold to a cotton planter in Mississippi at a moment's notice. He woke to a bell, worked under a whip, and slept in a locked cabin. Inside the swamp, however, the world was inverted. In the Maroon settlements, there were no masters. There were no overseers. There was no cotton or tobacco grown for the profit of a distant aristocrat. Decisions were made communally. If a man or woman showed leadership skills, they became an elder or a chief, regardless of their skin tone or lineage. Most profoundly, the swamp allowed for the preservation of African culture. While white planters stripped enslaved Africans of their names, languages, and religious practices, the deep recesses of the swamp served as a cultural time capsule. Archaeologists have found evidence of African-style spiritual practices in the swamp, including the arrangement of ritual caches of crystals, pebbles, and iron items beneath cabin floors to ward off evil spirits, a direct continuation of West African Minkisi traditions. For many Maroons, the swamp was the only home they had ever known. Generations of children were born in the Great Dismal Swamp, grew to adulthood, grew old, and died without ever setting foot on a plantation, without ever seeing a city, and without ever being owned by another human being. They were, by every definition of the word, American citizens born in a free republic of their own making. Chapter 6. The Guerrillas of the Cane Brake. But the peace of the swamp was a fragile one, maintained only through constant vigilance and a willingness to use terrifying violence when necessary. White society was acutely aware that the Great Dismal Swamp was a giant, throbbing wound in the side of the institution of slavery. Every runaway who successfully reached the swamp was not only a financial loss to their owner, but a dangerous example to those who remained on the plantations. The swamp was a beacon of hope, and hope was the enemy of the slaveholder. Periodically, wealthy planters would band together, hire professional slave catchers, arm them with heavy rifles and packs of vicious bloodhounds, and attempt to launch invasions into the swamp. These expeditions almost always ended in disaster for the white men. The Maroons possessed a home field advantage that no amount of firepower could overcome. They knew every trembling bog, every hidden quicksand pit, and every hollow tree. They developed an elaborate early warning system. When slave catchers entered the swamp, Maroons stationed on the perimeters would imitate the call of the barred owl or the cry of a bobcat. The signal would echo through the trees, traveling miles into the interior in a matter of minutes. By the time the slave catchers reached a village site, the cabins would be empty, the fires extinguished, and the Maroons gone, melted into the surrounding wilderness like ghosts. If the slave catchers pressed too far, the Maroons would strike back. They utilized classic guerrilla warfare tactics. They would ambush the pursuers in narrow, knee-deep water passes where the white men could not deploy their horses or line up their weapons. Maroons would drop from the branches of cypress trees onto the backs of the slave catchers, wielding long cane knives and spears. They would cut the throats of the hounds and vanish back into the brush before the white men could even reload their rifles. The swamp became a psychological terror for the slave catchers. Rumors spread among white communities about the swamp men, giant mythical black warriors who were bulletproof, who could see in the dark, and who commanded the dangerous animals of the bog. One of the most famous real-life leaders of these Maroon defenders was a man known simply as Osman. Osman was a towering African who escaped into the swamp in the early 19th century. He became the unofficial protector of the northern reaches of the Great Dismal. Osman was not content with merely hiding. He actively raided nearby plantations to liberate enslaved women and tools. In the 1850s, a white artist and writer named David Hunter Strother was sketching in the swamp when he actually encountered Osman. Strother expected to find a desperate, starving fugitive. Instead, he found a majestic, proud man standing in a clearing, draped in animal skins, carrying a highly polished rifle and exuding an aura of absolute authority. Osman allowed Strother to leave alive on one condition, that he tell the world outside that the black men in the swamp were free and that they intended to stay that way. Chapter 7. The Swamp and the Civil War. The climax of the Maroon story arrived with the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. For nearly 2 centuries, the Maroons had played a defensive game, protecting their hidden kingdom from the outside world. But when the Union and the Confederacy went to war, the Maroons recognized that the moment for total liberation had finally arrived. The Great Dismal Swamp became a strategic nightmare for the Confederate Army. The swamp sat directly between the vital Union-controlled waters of Hampton Roads in the Confederate interior of North Carolina. The Maroons did not hesitate. They formed alliances with the Union Army, acting as scouts, spies, and guides. They knew the terrain better than any mapmaker, and they led Union detachments through secret swamp pathways to launch surprise attacks on Confederate outposts and cut vital supply lines. In 1862, when the Union Army captured the surrounding regions of Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia, the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp did something extraordinary. They did not just walk out of the swamp as refugees. They marched out as liberators. Thousands of Maroon men rushed to enlist in the newly formed United States Colored Troops, USCT. These men, who had spent their entire lives fighting a guerrilla war against slavery in the swamps, became some of the fiercest, most disciplined soldiers in the Union Army. They wore the blue uniform with an unmatched pride, carrying their knowledge of the swamp into battles across Virginia and North Carolina. The swamp, which had been a refuge for the oppressed, had become a launching pad for the destruction of the slaveholders' republic. Chapter 8. The Great Erasure. When the Civil War ended in 1865 and the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery across the United States, the Maroon communities of the Great Dismal Swamp simply dissolved into the fabric of the newly freed nation. Many moved to nearby cities like Norfolk, Wilmington, and Baltimore to find work and reunite with families from whom they had been separated for generations. Others established free black farming communities along the edges of the swamp, continuing their deep connection to the land. But as the decades rolled on, a strange and tragic thing happened. The Maroons were systematically forgotten. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the era of Jim Crow and the rise of the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, white Southern historians intentionally rewrote the history of slavery. They promoted a false romanticized myth of the antebellum South, a myth where enslaved people were portrayed as docile, happy, and loyal to their masters, requiring the paternal care of white civilization. In this sanitized, manufactured history, there was absolutely no room for the Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp. The idea that thousands of black men and women had defied white authority for 200 years, built independent cities, defeated slave catchers, and lived completely free lives in the heart of the South was a direct threat to the ideology of white supremacy. So, they erased them. The Maroon villages were swallowed back up by the dense vegetation of the swamp. The wooden cabins rotted into the peat soil. The stone tools and clay pipes sank deep into the mud. For nearly a century, the only records of their existence were scattered. Dismissive mentions in old colonial runaway slave advertisements and local court records, which mainstream historians ignored. The greatest resistance movement in American history became nothing more than a whisper, a folktale told by elders in the black communities of Tidewater, Virginia. A myth of the swamp. People that many discounted as mere legend. Epilogue. The dead speak, but the truth has a way of rising to the surface no matter how deep you bury it. Today, thanks to the pioneering work of Dr. Dan Sayers and the ongoing efforts of modern historians and archaeologists, the Great Dismal Swamp Maroon landscape is finally recognized as one of the most important historical and cultural sites in North America. It is now part of the National Park Service's Underground Railroad network to freedom. When you look out over the black waters of the Great Dismal Swamp today, you are not just looking at a wildlife refuge. You are looking at a monument to the unyielding human spirit. The thousands of men, women, and children who lived on those hidden mud islands did something truly miraculous. Surrounded by an empire built on the total ownership of black bodies, they looked into the terrifying, mosquito-infested, venomous depths of the swamp and did not see a prison. They saw a sanctuary. They chose the hardships of the wilderness over the comforts of the plantation, because to them, a dangerous life lived in absolute freedom was infinitely better than a safe life spent in chains. They were the phantoms of the Dismal Swamp, and their legacy is a reminder that even in the darkest, most oppressive corners of history, the light of liberty can never be completely extinguished.